it's another one of those gaps in the description of the work that you're doing. So just like subtle energy, it's integral to what's going on, but it's kind of your awareness of it is kind of what made the difference in the practice. What you're able to, I guess it might be like a good thing to start with like two questions, like how it kind of began to be incorporated into your practice, and then maybe what precedes that, like what work on yourself you did that led to you being able to work with other people on it. Because it seems like a first person. It seems like it would have to be a first person experience before it's a second person experience.
To use those terms, first person, second person, third person, it gets mixed in there with ego awareness versus conscious awareness, and the whole idea of being aware from, as, or of. Ego aware, first person, is being aware from one's sense of their individual self. So it's a looking out at world, looking over at other, kind of like if you think of a lens that is limited to a certain perspective, right? A singular perspective. The nature of that experience is that the self is the thing looking. Everything one is then aware of out there, so to speak, is juxtaposed against this idea of the self that's looking. And of course, the big self-aware, self-conscious awakening, who am I kind of process is that at some point there is this dawning question of, wait a minute, who's looking? What is the self? So as far as developmentally in an individual's life, the general idea is that as a child, one is just looking, and they're not even questioning who's the looker. They're just looking out at world and just sort of being a self, operating in the world, having experiences. And of course, you can subdivide that into these phases where initially there's an identification or a narcissistic inclusion of various things in one's experience of self. Initially, everything is self, and then there's this developmental process where the mind starts to differentiate, for example, one's physical body from the physical environment. And as the development of that happens, that person starts to experience separateness physically, which offers the potential of autonomy and freedom, but it also threatens isolation and separateness. So as one becomes aware of one's physical separateness, one starts to become very needy and find an object in the environment to cling on to, which is the beginnings of object relating, attachment, etc. And so the child goes from just wanting to have their needs met and be held and be contained and be kept fed, to freaking out if they aren't held by their primary object, which typically is mother. So there's this developmental process that occurs throughout the whole human lifespan, but very much so in the early years. And Margaret Mahler's work with individuation is kind of the cornerstone of that in psychology. But several the object relations theorists and self-psychology and ego psychology and all those early schools in psychotherapy really look at those processes. But so if you bring it back to the idea of first person, initially, if we say that there's the person starts out unconscious, So the ego is operating, but there isn't consciousness. There's just ego awareness. And initially it's a first-person perspective, but there's not an awareness of the first person. It's just from the first person. And it starts out just immersed in or merged with or narcissistically including the environment in general. But then there's this process of individuating out and becoming more and more ego aware of separateness on various levels, physically, emotionally, sexually, mentally. And then around sometime in pre-adolescence, 9 years old is a age that gets put out there a lot. One has the horrifying experience of becoming ego aware of self, or what a lot of people will term quote unquote self-conscious, and thus begins the life of the ego identity. One becomes aware of oneself as an object in the world. So there's this developmental shift, and gone is then the innocence and bliss and wonder of childhood, where you were simply a subject living life. Now you've become an object to yourself, and that object is not only not a subject, but that object that we take as self now comes under intense scrutiny, and is subject to not only the judgment of everyone else in the world, but is worst of all subject to our own judgment. And of course, the way it seems to be set up is that we judge it to be very, very bad, very, very lacking. We have this idea of what good would be, of what ideal would be, and we become painfully aware that we fall far short of that. This is what Freud was getting at with his idea of the superego and the ego. The superego is that gaze from the perspective of a judgment of the ego. So when that shift happens and one becomes aware of oneself as an object, that perspective is a third person perspective. The view of oneself as an object is occurring from the outside back towards the first person. So now there's a third person ego experience. That third person ego gaze does not see a subject, it sees an object. It's only capable of seeing an object. The ego mind looks, and the ego mind cannot see essence. It can't see soul. It can't see spirit. It can't see ontological beingness. It's a mechanism it only has capabilities within the ego realm, which is kind of like saying within the matrix or something. It's an organ that only has capabilities within the environment that is the ego realm, and the general model here is that the ego realm is void of beingness. What is conscious first person? What is conscious third person? And then one of the all-important things to get at is eventually, what is second person experience? And when you get at second person experience, then I'll finally get back to answering your question about individual self versus like how do you work on an other or work with an other.
Well, I guess I think continuing on the first person, conscious experience, like that trajectory makes sense to me before it bends back to the answer to the question. One thing that just struck me as you were talking about it was it's like you have the questions of a 9-year-old, or the inquisitive nature of a 9-year-old, and suddenly you turn that on yourself. So you have these childish questions about the world in general, and then you make them about who you are as a person, and it just it's like self-defeating from the start. That was a scary, sad thought. That's what we all go through.
Right.
I mean, is it the first like void experience that we have? Because I feel like that's part of consciousness work. like this, that we see ourselves and we see that we're lacking. We have this judgment of what's there. Once we start to look at it, we think that there should be something there that's not, and then we're trying to fill that with validation and reassurance. And because I think, like, as far as the first person consciousness work, like it's holding that feeling first without immediately trying to fix it.
It's like we're incapable initially of just accepting, like, geez, I don't know, when I look back at myself, like, I see nothing. That's too threatening to the ego mind to just have that be the truth of it. That's a void experience. But we go immediately into just grabbing, creating this identity, grabbing onto whatever we can to fend off that existential nothingness.
At the same time, so I mean, it's like it's painful to know that's what we're going through. It's painful to experience, and it's necessary because the I think it gets at the whole pre-trans fallacy, but in a more like constructive way. I think that what the feeling we have before we experience that void or before we become self-conscious isn't really the truth either. So like that seeming oneness we feel, or that self-assurance we get from like intense object relating with our parents, or it's like a oneness that we get by identifying outside of ourselves more than what we learn about what's inside ourselves. So that void is like, pushing the ship away from shore. And because it's like a fantasy land in a way that you have to disembark from.
Yeah, I think Ken Wilber describes that well, where it's like if you take it from the narcissistic inclusion state all the way to a unity consciousness state, the pre-state it's all me from a narcissistic ego perspective, which is what Freud thought all spiritual experience is, that, right? He was an atheist, and so if someone was having, like one of the things he and Jung got into was, Jung was more of a spiritualist, and from Jung's perspective, that there was such a thing as a transpersonal experience, and Freud didn't think that. Freud thought that any kind of transpersonal unity consciousness type experience was actually a regressive state, a regressed state back towards the narcissistic oceanic oneness with world that the infant feels.
It's tough though, because I feel like there's so much evidence that he's right. Freud is right, but that's everybody else. It's not me.
And I love Freud. I mean, I'm constantly trying to defend Freud, and I feel like Freud's so demonized these days, and I think it's such a mistake because there was so much stuff that I think he had right that is important for humans to know.
If he just would have stayed in his lane a little more, I think everything would have been a little better. Anytime anyone tries to, branch out too much, they just end up saying things that they get remembered for that they wish they hadn't.
Right. That pre-trans thing, the shift from just the way you put it, that this experience of self is actually kind of this fantasy. There's a, that narcissistically including something or object relating with something is, you get this experience of self, but it's like, it's false with regard to delineating an idea of actual self with the thing. The experience is real, though. That's, it's one of the things that's so compelling. If you have the experience, we tend to take that as a proof of validity. And that's one of the kind of initial things that one has to realize is that just because you're experiencing it, doesn't mean it's really happening out there. It's sort of, it's a play on that saying that, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me. It's sort of the opposite of that, obviously that saying is kind of making fun of that. Just because you're paranoid, you take as proof that they're out to get you the fact that you feel paranoid. And we do that in these thorough ways on every level. I feel bad right now, so you must have done something wrong to me, Jeff,
Oh yeah.
Why would I feel bad right now unless
That's like the hardest thing to,
unless you did something?
I feel like that can be conceptually true for years before it's ever actually experienced as true.
Right. So the pre-trans thing, where were we going with that?
It was getting back to like voids, like it started with like the void experience and kind of how that shapes consciousness work.
Yeah. So the whole void idea is that the ego is faced with nothingness and sees that nothingness as absolutely threatening. Again, an analogy in the physical world would be the idea that space, meaning when we think about outside the Earth's atmosphere, our conceptual understanding of that is that absolutely threatening, right? That we're aware that if you leave the Earth's atmosphere, like you'll be destroyed. Like you can't live out there. You not only will be separated from Earth, which seems bad enough, if just the separation from your home planet, so to speak. But not only that, you can't breathe out there. Not only that, there's nothing to hang on to, nothing to be supported by or nurtured by. But worse than that, it's a vacuum out there. So every molecule in your system will just like explode. So it's kind of a bad environment. It's it's easy to see why the ego has a fear reaction and wants to cling to whatever it can to not be pulled into the void. Because the word that tends to get used for that in psychology is annihilation. That what the ego fears is annihilation, which is different than dying. The general idea is that annihilation is an end to existence, which is a different experience than an end to life, which of course gets into a spiritual philosophical conversation. But it's kind of an interesting thing that even atheists will use the concept of annihilation, and the basic idea is simply that whether it's an actual thing or not, there's an understanding that the human mind fears loss of life differently than the concept of dying is different than the concept of not existing at all. And the fear of not existing is a different kind of fear than the fear of not living. Manifests as different affects and different symptoms. Different defenses show up in response to one versus the other. But so that general idea of existential problems are of a different sort than life problems, are a different sort than self-esteem problems. They're all interrelated, but you can categorize them, certainly based on manifest symptoms. And then that obviously comes back to, well, why are there all these different schools of psychotherapy? It's like, well, because there's different types of issues. Is someone dealing more with an existential issue? Are they dealing more with a self-esteem issue? Are they dealing more with just a circumstantial issue in their life? Are they dealing with a relationship issue? Are they dealing more with a cognitive belief system issue? And you have all these schools of thought that where the methodology and the scope of it is aimed at one of those versus another one. And so there's great wisdom in that. The object relations school is different than then the relational school is different than the behavioral school. And then we have this situation that I'm always getting on my soapbox about. In current day, not only are students not taught what the difference is between these different schools, right? People come out with a PhD not knowing much at all about the different schools of psychotherapy, about what they are, what their methodologies are. And most importantly, they don't even understand that they are designed to deal with a different type of issue than another school. So you have the vast majority of therapists either saying they do this school or that, even though they don't even know really what that school is relative to the other schools. But more and more these days, everyone just says, well, I'm eclectic. I just do this broad, range of techniques. And my sense is, no, you don't. You do your particular one, which some people it's existential because that's kind of how that's what they're into. Some people it's more relational. Some people it's more cognitive. But, they'll have a certain label and they'll just kind of do their work. And then worst of all, no matter who the client is and what actual issue the client is having and is coming to psychotherapy for, the therapist just does their same type of therapy they do with every client, which is just this ridiculous situation. So it ends up being back on the client to somehow figure out, is the type of therapy they're getting right now the type of therapy that actually pertains to the type of issue they're dealing with, which of course almost no clients get that figured out on their own.
Yeah, not for a few years anyway.
Yeah, right. And that's all to say nothing of the ridiculous insurance information or situation we have going on. So the whole thing is just such a shit show. It's unbelievable.
But back to consciousness work.
The only thing to do is to become enlightened. It's the only way.
Perfect. Put a bow on it.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.